So please help me welcome Sakina and Anika Francis.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Anika. This is my mother, Sakina.
Mental illness is a very serious subject. I always like to start off with something a little bit light. What did one eye say to the other eye?
I see.
There's something between us and it smells. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my early life. My life is Cinderella in reverse. She had nothing and went to everything. I had everything and went to nothing. I was raised in Cleveland, Ohio with a middle-class family, went to high school, voted prettiest girl in my class in high school, went on to college. My senior year, I was homecoming queen. That same year I married, and in a couple of years I had a couple of children. Well, after that, that's when schizophrenia struck. I went from homecoming queen to homeless. Mental illness has no prejudice. You can be male or female, rich or poor, brown to yellow, fat or small. I'm going to tell you some of my crisis times. I was living in Atlanta, 25 years old, thought the world was on a string for me when I started hearing voices in my head, and from the radio, and from the TV, and sometimes I thought from God. My husband didn't know what to do with me, so he left. I struggled 3 months alone with my 2 small children. Then my husband took them for a weekend visit. Within a half an hour, I thought the house was going to catch on fire. So I rushed to a friend's home. No makeup, dirty clothes, unexpected. I was there 3 days when I called her daughter a devil. She called my husband to come get me, and I would have done the same. He drove me to a hospital, and I had the most important interview of my life. I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. No one explained what schizophrenia was or that recovery was even possible. That's why organizations like NAMI are so important, because they educate consumers and families about mental illness recovery. Well, when I was taken to the psychiatric floor, I was furious. It's funny to look back now because me and all the other patients thought there was nothing wrong with us. It was them, not us. Many crisis years would go by before I accepted having my diagnosis. My second hospitalization was in Hartford, Connecticut. Voices told me people were after me to go stay with my couple friend in Hartford, Connecticut from Atlanta, Georgia. I was there 2 weeks and the wife kicked us out. Anika and I were homeless that night, so we slept on church steps. The next day, staying warm in a hospital waiting room, the welfare office decision was to put me in a straitjacket while Anika screamed, and as I was being pushed out on a stretcher, I gave her all the money I had in the world, 14 cents. Thank goodness Anika doesn't remember what happened because she was very upset. She was 5 years old. They took me on a 45-minute drive to a long-term mental hospital and put Anika in a foster home. Thank goodness my parents came to get her and brought her to Cleveland. The next day for me, I thought, my husband is gone, no money, no car, but I had hope that Anika and I will go back to Atlanta. Hope can go a long way. I was in a mental hospital 3 months, and it was getting close for Anika to go back to school. I had to have a lawyer to keep custody of Anika, but my parents were given custody. I was devastated. Anika was gone, I thought. I also thought I'll never get out of the mental hospital. The first time out of the locked building, I walked to the lake to drown myself. When the water was over my head, something inside me heard Anika say, "What happened to my mommy?" I came out of that water, never to try suicide again. Anika, what was it like for you in my crisis times?
Well, there's a lot of things about my early childhood that I don't remember. But one very clear memory that I have was winding up in foster care after my mother was taken to the hospital. And I just didn't know why I was there and why my mom didn't come for me or where my family was. And sadly, that's a very common experience for children of parents with a serious mental illness. About 50% of mothers with schizophrenia lose custody of their children, either permanently or temporarily. And many of these kids wind up in foster care system or raised by their extended family, which was the case for me. I was fortunate that my grandparents found me, which was probably not an easy thing because when my mother gets sick, she tends to cut off the family. So they really didn't know where we were. But they managed to locate me, and so they came and got me. And I don't think I've ever been so happy to see people that I know probably in my life. And I moved with them to Cleveland, Ohio. And for me, living with my grandparents was wonderful because it was such a form of stability that I really hadn't had for much of my early life. And I'm very close with my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather, he was always like my rock. I could always depend on him to be there. And when things would get just kind of up in the air and just havoc with my mother, I knew I could always count on him. And there's a lot to be said for that. He was a very proud man, but very humble, and he really valued family. And I was also very close to my grandmother. She was a substitute teacher, and she loved to teach, and I loved to learn. And when I first moved there, it was just before the first grade. And so I hadn't been in kindergarten, and so my grandmother was really worried about making sure that I was all prepared for school. She was pleasantly surprised because my mother had been teaching me while I was at kind of homeschooling me, so I actually knew quite a bit. But I often credit her for my lifelong love of learning, which has really helped to shape much of my life. We were fortunate because my grandparents made a way for my mother and I to live together. And without them, I doubt that we would have the close relationship that we do and that we would be here today. But as close as I was to my grandparents, I still missed my mother. She was in Connecticut in that long-term hospital that she mentioned. And even though she was there, I wanted her to be home with me. We would talk on the phone, and I remember when she was finally going to be coming home, and I was so excited I would count off the days. And my grandmother and I went to the airport to meet her. Well, the woman who got off the plane wasn't the mother that I remembered. My mom had been much more feisty and lively, but when she came home from the hospital, she just seemed like she was devoid of emotion. She was very distant and kind of cold, almost like a zombie. Now I know that's more the flat effect which can happen with the medicine, but I was going into the first grade, so I didn't understand what was happening. But I was honestly kind of used to that because I had to really roll with the punches when I was little. Growing up with a mother with schizophrenia was like being on an emotional roller coaster that I couldn't get off of, especially the first 12 years of her illness, because she was on and off of her medicine, in and out of the hospital, which also meant that she was in and out of my life. And that was hard for me to understand because I really didn't understand her illness. I'll share a passage from the book that talks a little bit about that. My mother's absence was most conspicuous when I was around other kids who all lived with their parents. At first, they asked where my mom was, so I told them she was sick and needed to get better before she came home. I didn't know what to say when they asked what was wrong with her. All my grandparents told me was that she was in the hospital because she was sick. No one ever explained exactly what kind of sickness she had and why it was taking her so long to get better. In time, I came to understand that she had a sickness of the mind. I didn't really know what that meant. At that age, it was more like a monster under the bed for me. And it would jump out unexpectedly, and it would cause my mother to change from this loving, caring person that I knew into this very distant and cold and paranoid woman who spent all of this time in a world created in her own mind. And it was a world that I wasn't invited into. And that was difficult, especially because I was so young. And the more time that my mother spent in that world, the less she cared about what was happening in this world. And so I had to really grow up quickly when my mother was in her crisis times because I had to help my family to take care of her. And so I became a child caregiver at a young age. And I know that my family was worried about the toll that that would take on me. Before I went into the first grade, I remember they took me to a psychiatrist. And even at that very young age, I knew that I was not going to be talking to the psychiatrist because to me, doctors were the ones who took my mother away from me. So I had a very deep distrust for them. And so when I went in there, at all costs, I wanted to make it seem like I was just fine. And I must have done a good job, because after maybe 2 or 3 visits, I guess I was deemed okay. And so we never really talked about it again, and I never saw anyone else. And though I made it seem like everything was okay, it really wasn't. And a lot of times I did struggle, but I just did it silently. Because when there was so much crisis in the family, I didn't feel like my family could really afford to deal with any of my emotional stuff too. So I really got used to just holding everything in. And so crisis times are really hard on all of us. One of the things that helped me to get through it was love. Love is often what gives caregivers the strength to tough it out in the trenches with a loved one with a serious mental illness. For me, it helped me to see past my mother's illness and to remember that we did have a loving and a caring relationship. It gave me something to hold on to when it seemed like things were falling apart. And there's a lot to be said for that. But at the end of the day, even though my mom wasn't kind of the same person that I knew when she came back, I was glad that she was there. She would sleep a lot and she wasn't always involved with my life, but I knew she was there, and that made me happy. And my grandmother pretty much did everything for me until she passed away when I was in the 3rd grade. And that was a devastating time for me. But I never really shared what that was like. I would just cry myself to sleep, but I learned how to just hold it all in. Mom, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like for you once she passed away?
After my mother passed, I came back to life. I won my daughter. I started driving again, took her to music, dance, tennis classes, played games with her. My mental health center had me seeing the psychiatrist once a week to make sure I was okay. Well, we should have had someone counseling and talking with Anika also. After several months, my psychiatrist saw how well I was doing, then started reducing my medicine. In hindsight, I was okay with what I was on. I became a little mentally ill because I still had some medicine in my system. My dad was calling my center, telling them to get me back on medicine. I was furious with him, so I left the house, having my sister come to pick up Anika. I was angry with my dad, but went back to his house with Anika when she was returned by my sister, and she started school. My dad told me he was glad I was on full medicine, but I could not lay on the sofa sleeping all day. I had to get out the house. Well, I started going to a mental health center. I can't say enough good about mental health centers. When I went to my first one, I was sleeping on the chair all the time, and my peers said, "You're over-medicated." The next time I told my psychiatrist, he lowered the medicine and I woke up. I like to say, a sick bird can help another sick bird. Well, at the mental health centers, they had activities, they had classes like interviewing for a job, newspaper reading, book club. People that like to cook, they would cook a lunch and we buy it for inexpensive. Then sometimes they would have groups. And what was really nice, I met 3 girls. One drove, and once a month we'd look for coupons at restaurants, and once a month we'd go out to eat. And I'll never forget this one time we went to a seafood restaurant, and one of the girls ordered frog legs. And we laughed about that. It was so funny. I kept in touch with them for at least 25 years until 2 of them passed away. After my father said I had to get out the house, I volunteered at a senior center and did so well they gave me a permanent part-time secretarial job. I was always drowsy, but it was manageable. Then the center director asked if I wanted another part-time job to make it full-time. I reluctantly said yes. Well, me being more drowsy, and I decided to stop taking the medicine to be more awake at work. What did I do that for? My dad noticed a decline and started calling my job again. I was drinking beer and wine, trying to find somewhere for me and Anika to live without his house. When the job told me not to come back until I take medicine, I was furious with my dad. When I returned to his apartment, I locked him out of the place. Nika had to climb through a window when I was just sitting there in the bedroom. After they got in, my father came into the hall, looked at me, and I looked at him. Well, the next day after Nika left for school, 2 police people came to take me to a mental hospital. They were calm with me, I was calm with them. I never lived with him again, and I grew up. I believe caregivers have to have boundaries, or we could be a terror in your house. I've had several, too many, and I hope never again, mental health hospital stays. Some bad, mostly good. After the police escorted me out of my dad's home, that night I was in a small TV room alone watching TV. At 11 o'clock, an aide came in and said, "Time to go to bed," and switched off the TV. I said, "You don't tell me when to go to bed," and switched it back on. 5 minutes later, 4 burly men came in to say, "It's time to go to bed." And I said again, "You don't tell me when it's time to go to bed." Well, 2 of them took my ankles and 2 of them took my wrists, and I don't know where I found the strength, but I was fighting them and moving around. They took me to a room, padlocked my ankles and my wrists to the bed. And I believe that was a little bit of overkill just for not going to bed. And I really believe that aide wanted to take a nap. Another one, a lady nurse saw how much fun I was having, shooting pool, ping pong, listening to a record player. Next thing I know, 2 burly men come in, this is a separate hospital, come in and take the ping pong paddle from me and walk me down a hall I had never seen. They put me in a padded room, empty with only the floor to eat, sleep, and sit on. I was there 2 days. But on another note, I had nurses give me extra food. One listened to me daily about my life. Another one bought me new clothes. And another one gave me $5 when I was leaving because I didn't have any money. Anika, what happened to you during these times?
Well, as my mother kind of talked about, she did come back to life a lot once my grandmother passed away. And I always had a good relationship with my mother when she was stable, because we'd have fun together, we would always listen to music, we would laugh, we'd play games, so we were very close. But the problem was just that I couldn't always depend on it. About 6 months after my grandmother passed away, my mother got sick again and she wound up in the hospital. So within 6 months, I lost both mother figures in my life, which was very devastating for me. But I really didn't share just how hard it was for me. And part of the reason why I didn't is because I felt like I just couldn't voice all the things that I felt. There's a passage that I'll share that kind of talks a bit about it. The loss of my mother blasted me beyond feeling. It was as if I couldn't afford to feel things fully because it was too painful. So I disconnected from those feelings for fear they would overpower me. I folded inward emotionally, and I wouldn't let anyone come close. And so one of the reasons that I felt that I couldn't really express a lot of things is because there was this need I often felt to be strong. Around this time, my grandfather decided to move, which I could understand. He had lived in that house a long time with his wife and after she passed. So he bought an apartment building and we were moving across town. And I remember my aunt came up and we were in the car and she had one of those talks with me. And she said she knew how difficult everything had been with my grandmother and also my mother as well. And she said that they really needed me to be strong, just to be able to help out, and my grandfather needed that. So at that very young age, the way that I interpreted being strong meant that no matter what, you always support your family, even if that meant your needs weren't taken care of. It meant that I never showed if I was vulnerable, and I only asked for help if I was practically on my deathbed. And so at that very young age, that's what being strong meant to me. Now, my grandfather had groups he had a group like NAMI, a family support group that he was involved in for probably a few decades. But as a child, I never had any of those groups or any of those outlets. So I didn't have anyone to talk to about what I was feeling. And I think my family was so concerned that I was so young and I seemed to be doing well, so they didn't really want to bring it up either. And so I was just left to really process all of this myself. One of the reasons that I decided to share my story is because I really wanted to bring more awareness to the specific needs of children of parents with a serious mental illness. Because while there's a lot of different resources for families, a lot of times kids have unique needs. A lot of times some of the things I think are needed are some developmentally appropriate ways to explain mental illness to children based on their age, but also to have different groups for them to be able to express, and also just to have fun. I didn't have enough fun when I was little. It's interesting when my mother and I sometimes go through pictures and we see pictures of me from that time. And I mean, I look like at the age of probably 6 to 10, like I just carried the weight of the world. In a lot of ways I did, because I just didn't know anything else and I didn't know how to actually get the help that was available for me. And I also learned not only to kind of keep the secret about just what I felt, but also about my mom. I was always worried about stigma. You know, I would kind of hear the hushed tones that my family would kind of talk about my mom's illness. So I kind of just learned that that meant while we knew in the house that we didn't really share that outside the home. So I got very good at kind of sidestepping questions about what was happening with my mom. And I really at all costs tried to really avoid kind of sharing too much about that. And that need to kind of keep the secret and all of that really weighed on me, but I never really shared how much. And even my family to this day was very shocked when the book came out, because they never knew that I really wasn't as strong as I had always let on. And that's something that I often talk to caregivers about, because we can get into that role of caring for our loved one. And oftentimes we do have to hold things together. But sometimes we're so focused on that role that we don't always take that time for self-care, to do things that also rejuvenate us, and for those things that we need to do as well. And so I always talk about the importance of having that balance. But unfortunately, that was not something that I learned for many, many years. And I wish that I had learned it when I was young, especially the last time that I lived with my mother. And she'll share a little bit about that.
Okay. It was challenging being a mother with schizophrenia. I still remember the last time I lived alone with Anika. She was in the 7th grade. I had my own government help place, and we were living together alone for the first time in many years. I was so happy. I had my daughter again. I felt like a mother. The problem was she commented often about how big my stomach was getting, and I was gaining the mental health weight that you get when you take medicine. And it also made me sleepy all the time. I wanted to be more alert for Anika. I couldn't help her with her homework or even watch a movie without falling asleep. My solution was to stop getting my mental health shot so I could be more present in her life. Well, I declined quickly, and in my wildest dreams I lost her anyway. I ended up getting locked out of my house, walking around homeless, sleeping on a hill overlooking Lake Erie, eating out of church vans downtown. Then the voices, which don't tell you good things, told me to get out of Cleveland. So I climbed on a standing train. Thank goodness someone called the police. And now I say I am my brother's keeper, and I will help people that I don't know. Had the police talked to me 10 minutes, they would have known I was mentally ill, but since they didn't, they took me to jail. I was in a holding cell with 7 other ladies, and 10 minutes later, the guards came in with a boxed lunch for everyone. I smiled and felt I had gone to heaven. Food and a place to stay. After that steak and lobster, what it tasted like to me, but actually a sandwich and a fruit, I had to get a mugshot. I was smiling so much, the guard taking the picture said, "Francis, what's so funny?" Well, the social worker's husband at the jail went to college with me, and she let me know from the beginning she was concerned. After being in jail a week, off my medicine, in there for being a bum, homeless, destitute, whatever. I had the nerve to get into a murderer's face about her taking up too much mirror time. She turned around and said, "What?" The next thing I know, we're on the floor fighting. It seemed like the next day, but it wasn't. The social worker got me out of that jail and into a mental hospital where I belong. Anika said I might still be in there if it wasn't for her, even though it was about 30 years ago. Anika, do you want to share about the time we lived together?
Well, I was really excited when I was going to be living alone with my mom because I felt like a normal kid. And that's, when you grow up with a parent with a serious mental illness, just to feel normal, that's a big deal. So I was really excited, and we had a really good time the first few months because my mom's always a lot of fun, as you can kind of hear. So we would go to the art museum. She always knew that I liked to draw, so she signed me up for art classes, and we kind of go to Lake Erie, go swimming. So we did all kinds of things. But then, as she mentioned, she stopped taking her medicine. And so I started to see the symptoms and the signs, although I wanted to act like I wasn't seeing them. Usually the first one was that she starts to get paranoid and would start cutting some of the family members off. And at first I tried to act like it was, maybe she's just, upset with whomever, but it started happening more and more. And then I knew what it probably was, even though I didn't really want to admit it. And I also noticed that she'd start sometimes just staring off, and she'd start spending a lot of time just in her own mind. And I remember I would come home from school, and I'd walk home with those steps, and I would just have such a heaviness about me because I would be so worried. I was worried about would my mom be there, because part of me always worried that she might just wander off and not come back. And she was always there, which was good. But I remember sometimes I would come in and she would just be at the kitchen table and she would just write. She would just be writing for hours, and I didn't even know what exactly it was that she was writing. And it was really hard because I wanted to save her from her mental illness. And it was really different this time because I didn't have the buffer of my grandparents being there with me. And so I was there all alone to really try to deal with things. And of course my family noticed and they would call, but I would try to act like it wasn't as bad as it was because I never wanted my mother to go to the hospital, because I didn't know what happened at the hospital. I just knew she would go there, and I never visited my mother when she was in the hospital. And I always knew she was better when she came back, but I was always afraid that maybe she wouldn't come back. So I would rather her be home and sick with me than someplace else. And so I was trying my best to hold everything together, but it felt like quicksand. And it's really hard to hold and keep quicksand together. The ways that I coped at that time, a lot of times I would study. I just gained this laser-like focus at that time. And I would read and I would write, because that was ways that I could just go someplace else. And there was a lot of times when I needed to be able to do that. The other way that I coped was with what I like to call my emotional junk closet. So that was that place where I would toss all of my uncomfortable and challenging emotions that I really wasn't ready to deal with, and I would just toss them into this junk closet. And so for me, it was this way that I could just kind of deal with things, because when there was this crisis times, I didn't really have time to deal with all of my stuff, so I just tossed it back there. And that was some of the ways that I just was able to get through. And all of this culminated with a week that we spent in this hotel room. I don't remember what happened, but something happened at the house, and my mom's like, we have to go, and so we got this hotel room. And that meant that I wasn't going to go to school for a week. And school was a big deal for me. That was kind of how I always was, my family, I did well. And so me being out of school for a week was a big deal. But I knew my mom was really sick at this point. And I knew that if I left, I didn't know what would happen to her. Because at this point, she had cut everybody off. And so I was her last link. And so I stuck it out in that hotel room as long as I could. But it was tough because I was in this one room with my mom. She wasn't talking very much. And then when she was talking, she wasn't always making a lot of sense. And so I knew if I stayed that I might go insane too. And so I had to make that really tough choice. So I had to leave. And I went back to the house and I called my grandfather, who was always my rock, and I said, Papa, I need you to come get me. And he didn't ask any questions. He said, I'll be there in a few hours, pack up what you can. And so we put as much of my stuff as we could in the car, and then we left. But it was with a very heavy heart because I felt so much guilt because I wanted to be able to save my mother. And the fact that I couldn't just really stayed with me. And I remember maybe a week or two later, we went back to the house to check up on my mom. And she wasn't there. And she wouldn't answer the calls, so I was like, I didn't know if we lost her. And that was when she ended up in jail. We're fortunate because she ended up in a long-term hospital. But today they've closed a lot of these long-term hospitals. And so unfortunately for a lot of people with untreated serious mental illnesses, they're a lot of times winding up in jail or on the streets. And so had that happened today, it might be a very different situation for my mother and I. And that's something that's always very sad for me too, as I look at the state of things. So we had lost my mom. At least at that time, we didn't know where she was. And so I was getting older. I was in the 7th grade. And so my aunt and uncle lived in Cincinnati, and they came and said, you know, Papa's getting older and you're about to become a teen. And so they said, you can come and live with us. You get to choose. They said, but if you come and stay with us, you have to stay with us for all of high school because you do need some more stability. And so I thought about it. And I was like, you know, Papa is getting older, and I'm sure I'm going to be a handful. So I decided to move with them. And it was really tough because I didn't know where my mom was. Fortunately, she did get into the hospital and she reached out to the family again. And I felt like I could come back to life at that point. And then that was when she entered into her first long-term recovery. And so those are much better times for us. You want to share a bit about that, Mom?
I was in a long-term hospital, and a new agency came to the hospital. And they had a program called Community Living. You would have your psychiatrist, case manager, and social worker right at your fingertips. They drove me to find an apartment. It was 5 minutes away from the center, and they furnished it. For 17 years, until the money ran out, they paid $100 of my rent. I was involved with this new center. We had gone to Columbus for some kind of event, and I was telling them how there was such a good group at the other center I went to, with peers talking to each other, and they said, well, maybe we'll start one here, and they did. And it was a peer group run by a nurse, and we could talk, and we kept a lot of each other out of the hospitals, just tweaking each other, so we see something wrong, and like I said, we could see it, and we tweak each other. Well, I started going to that weekly group, and my case manager got me a job as a skycap at the airport. That was so much fun. I would check bags. I did bags for Stevie Wonder, Shirley MacLaine, Phil Donahue. I got tickets to sporting events, tickets to singing concerts, and I would have tips, and I'd come home every day with a pocket full of singles. So it was so much fun. My peers started looking up to me because I had a job. Anika could tell her friends that I worked. It gave me confidence and made me want to continue being a role model. I had never lived in my own place over a year. I've been in that same apartment since that time, 25 years. With my dad, Anika was grown and living in Atlanta, and my 2 sisters lived in Cincinnati. I was his only child in Cleveland when he developed Alzheimer's. The Lord let me take care of my father like he took care of me, at his home, then assisted living, and then at the nursing home. At the nursing home, I would soak his nails, soak his feet. It took me like an hour and a half to get there when he was assisted living on the bus, but I would go there once a week to help with him. And when he was in a nursing home, we had some music. I knew all the war songs, but our favorite song was Nat King Cole and Natalie Cole, Unforgettable. I would put that on, and we would just sing to each other, Unforgettable. So we had some happy times. And that's just to say, even though he went through a lot with me, I was able to kind of feel, don't count us out. And Anika said I redeemed myself with him. I tell my sister things that were questionable, and she would take care of it. About my sisters, in recovery, we're great. They just don't understand it all. They are good candidates for NAMI's Family to Family course. Being a parent can encourage people with serious mental illnesses to stay in recovery. I'm talking for my peers. We should see our children 3 times a year, on their birthday, a holiday, and another special time. Children want to know who their natural parents are, and the parents want to keep up with their children, and I believe it will keep us healthier longer. Sadly, there are not enough programs to teach consumers parenting skills. I had never worked over 7 months. After working 7 years at the airport, I thought I was doing so well I didn't need medicine. In fact, that's the only reason why I was doing so well. I slowly reduced it and slowly became more and more insane. Everybody noticed but me. After being completely off, making a fool of myself, the final straw was walking in the middle of a busy street at midnight, ranting and raving some religious hogwash. Can you believe I didn't think that was bizarre? Some merchant called the police, and they thankfully took me to a mental hospital. After getting back on medicine, out of the hospital, I was in a respite house. Thank goodness I had been a good tenant for years, because the manager at my apartment didn't kick me out. Now, a respite house is where consumers go after hospitalization to get back into the swing of things of living on your own, taking your medicine as prescribed, cooking, paying bills. Well, there I had a revelation. I missed Anika's college graduation. My dad was getting older, and I couldn't blame him for this relapse. I thought, if taking medicine makes me the loving, caring person I know I can be, I'll take the medicine. Ladies take medicine for diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol. I have to take it for mental wellness. That was 17 years ago, and I have not missed a day. Since my last recovery of 17 years, I had love of a man for 4 years, continued friendships 17 to 20 years. My father was in a family support group when I was in crisis, and I try to still support them. The widowed ladies would cook him sweets and pies, knowing his sweet tooth, and he had somebody to comfort him when I was not myself. He was a member of that family support group 25 years, and 20 of those years he was president. Wow. Through volunteering 3 months, I was asked if I wanted a part-time job being activities person at an Alzheimer's nursing home. That was such a fun job. We'd have sing-alongs, we'd have bingo. I'd tell them a joke one week, and they would laugh and laugh. I'd tell them that same joke the next week, and they would laugh and laugh. After working there 4 years as a good, on my own worker, I decided to come out and tell my boss and director I take mental health medicine. They both said they were so relieved they thought I was quitting. After that, I told my coworkers, and unbelievably, I didn't feel any stigma. I worked there for another 4 years, a total of 8 years, until the nursing home closed. I couldn't find another job, so I called NAMI about any kind of programs they have for children caregivers. Well, they said they didn't have any, but they had a speakers bureau if I would like to come. The rest is history. Anika said I would send my speeches to her, and together we worked on a book, and I worked on it at NAMI, just on a little kitchen table. When things would get too rough writing the book, I would just stop, go out and talk to people. They didn't know what I was doing, and talk with them. At NAMI, I was Volunteer of the Year in 2012, and last month I was voted unanimously to be on NAMI Greater Cleveland's Board of Directors. Anika, talk a little bit about the life you had when I was in recovery.
Well, when my mother was in recovery, I felt that automatically meant that the challenges and the struggles that I went through were also just kind of voided out. And so those were like good times for us. And in a lot of ways they were. One of my coping mechanisms, which I kind of talked a bit about, was studying. And so I was definitely a bit of a nerd when I was growing up, but it paid off for me when it was time for high school, because I won a scholarship to a very elite private school. And I did very well in the school. And I remember it was my junior year, and it was time to run for student council president. And a lot of people suggested that I run. But I had to kind of think about it, because here I was in a school with kids who on their 16th birthday, they would get all these expensive cars. They had spent their whole life in private school and had really led a life of privilege. And my life growing up with a mother with schizophrenia had been far from that. And so I kind of wondered, can I really be a leader? And what if by chance they find out about my mom? And was I really willing to put myself out there to find out? And so I found myself with what I like to call one of those defining life choices, because I feel like we always are presented with opportunities where we can choose something better, but sometimes it can be hard to make those choices, especially after life has knocked you down a few times, because it can take a lot of strength and a lot of courage to put yourself out there, or even just to do something different. And I remember talking with my mom about it. We lived in different places, but we were very close. And she encouraged me to run. My mother has always felt that there's nothing that I can't do, and she's been my biggest cheerleader. And so at that time, when I had a lot of self-doubt, she really helped me to believe in myself. So I made a very conscious choice that I was going to run, because I didn't want my childhood to limit or to define my life. I ended up winning that election. And when I did, I had one of those moments where I just kind of saw things clearly. And I realized that it had been actually my childhood that had helped me to succeed, because I had cultivated this profound inner strength. I needed that so I didn't get swallowed up by the things that happened when I was little. I also had this laser-like focus. I mean, I can focus like nobody else when the time comes. I think because things would sometimes be so wild in the house that I just learned how to tune everything out. And so it made it very good for me when it came time to study. But I could also connect with all different types of people, because I knew the people in the neighborhood who talked to themselves. I knew they were good people. And so I could connect with them, I could connect with the people who had all kinds of money, and it didn't really matter to me. And all of those things served me very well when I was in high school and also throughout my life. I went on to an Ivy League college, I got my master's, I've lived abroad, I've started my own businesses as well too. And what I've come to learn is that out of great challenge and pain can also come some really great gifts. But a lot of times we may have to dig those out, and we might need some support along the way. That's why organizations like NAMI and my mom at that time can be so important, because they can help us to find our own gifts. Because I was so resilient for much of my life, and I always seemed like I was so well adapted, I really didn't think I had to deal with the stuff in my childhood. So I had never dealt with that emotional junk closet that I talked with earlier. And so the thing about resilience, it's kind of that bounce back factor. But it can get really hard to bounce back when you're toting around so much emotional baggage. And that was the case for me. Although I never really saw it. I didn't really realize all the ways some of the things in my childhood were playing out in my life. For instance, I think I had a beacon that said, if you need saving, I'm the one. And so that came up a lot in my relationships, which was not a good thing, but I didn't see that. The other piece was that need to always be in control and to always appear that I was strong. Well, doing that means that I didn't get the support that I needed. And doing that over time becomes a very hard role, and it's really hard to sustain that. The other thing was that need to be a savior. Because I couldn't save my mother, I was always trying to keep playing that out. And so I had one of those moments, and I think we all get them. It's that moment when you can kind of look into the mirror of self. And I think it takes a lot of courage to look in that mirror, because sometimes we don't always like the things that we see. And so I think I had a bad breakup, and I got sick, and so I was laying there on the couch, and I saw all of these different things, and I realized they were coming from my childhood, and I had never really dealt with all of my stuff. And so I knew that I wanted to heal. I had no idea how I was going to do that. For my mom, she knew that she could take a pill. But what did that look like for me? And I think that's a question probably a lot of caregivers may face, because we can also be in our own ways traumatized or really impacted by the things that happen to a loved one. And so I didn't know the path. But I've always believed that when you set an intention, sometimes the way can be presented if you're really listening. And so my path wasn't probably the most traditional. It led me down the route of doing things like yoga and meditation. And those things really helped me to create more balance and to start to clear out my junk closet. But that wasn't easy, because if you've ever had a junk closet and tried to clear it out, the first step is even just getting up the courage to actually open the door, because you know what lies back there. And so for me, I finally had to look at that elephant that was in the middle of the room. So as I kind of mentioned, my family really hadn't talked a lot about these different things. And I certainly never expressed all the things that happened to me. So part of my process was that I actually had to admit that I actually struggled, that I wasn't always as strong as I let on. And that wasn't easy to do. And it was messy, as anytime you're cleaning out a junk closet. And it took time. I'd like to say I accomplished this in a month, but it was years. And then I also had to learn how to forgive and to let go, because sometimes we can get so caught up in those stories that we don't want to let that go, because we can get something out of that. And so that was a process that I really had to learn. And as I got through it, it was then that I was really able to appreciate and really see some of the gifts that had come out of my past. But it took me a long time to get there. And I think I also came to just appreciate the love that was always there for me, which is part of what inspired the title of our book. And I wanted to share just a passage about that. What I've learned about love along the way is that it's an awe-inspiring force that has the power to heal and transform. Love led my mother and I through dark times in our life. Even when my mother was in the darkest days of her mental illness, she always held on to her love for me. It was love that guided her out of the water when she considered committing suicide. The love we have for each other and the love our family had for us was like cement. It held us together, even when the cracks began to spread. There is a true power in that.
I get a swig of water, please? I'm going to just take the conclusion. Well, to start off with, God is the source of our abundance. During my present recovery, I have held a part-time job 8 years, served on Bridgeway's board, another mental health service, 2 years until it closed. I have given 50 speeches over 7 years with NAMI's In Our Own Voice program, and last month voted unanimously, like I said, to the NAMI Greater Cleveland Board. Anika has a bachelor's and master's degree. She's traveled the world and is a licensed yoga therapist and teacher. Together, for 5 long years, we wrote our journey through a serious mental illness memoir titled Love's All That Makes Sense. We were the victims of mental illness. Now we are the victors. Thank you. Any questions?
I was very resilient, so I was very good at playing that role. I think that one time that I was out of school for a week, my family had to kind of explain what was happening, but who did kind of step up with some of my childhood friends, like their parents would kind of see what was happening and they would keep an eye out because they actually knew. But if you never knew, I was very good at playing the role, and I always looked very resilient, and I wore that mask for a very long time. I mean, my family they were shocked even when they read the book, and I just was so good at playing that part because that was what I knew. Yeah.
When did you were constantly sort of holding it in about your mother. When did you finally let it out? When did you finally feel free to talk, say that my mother has paranoid schizophrenia?
It was probably, and it's interesting because I didn't even know my mother's diagnosis until we started working on the book. And I didn't, it wasn't even something I thought about. I should probably know that. It was this thing that I kind of knew was there, but it wasn't something I just ever wanted to kind of dig into. So it was really probably in the process. She was very involved in the mental health center, so we were all kind of involved in a lot of that piece. So I was very comfortable kind of about the fact that she kind of goes to centers and things like that. But I don't think I really talked about it as openly with people who weren't in my inner circle, probably until maybe like the last 10 years or so. And so it's kind of interesting now having the book out because, after years of really holding my story in, and it's been really interesting because as I've opened up to share my story, it's amazing because now everybody else feels comfortable to share theirs. And so it's amazing just to hear how many people really do deal with mental illness, whether themselves or a family member, and how many people are really impacted. And so that's been really powerful to hear because it's so far more pervasive than perhaps even I would have thought.
Well, when I had my first mental illness, I talked about struggling with my two daughters. Well, and my husband took me to the mental hospital. Well, I was there 3 weeks, and my daughter was kind of sickly, but I always took care of her. She was a baby. Well, I was in the hospital 3 weeks. I got a chance to come home after 2 weeks, just for a weekend, and my daughter and Anika were kind of distant from me, but the baby finally came back to me. Well, when I got out after 3 weeks, Anika and the baby were given back to me, and she was sick, and I would be rubbing her back, walking out of the house. She wouldn't eat. She was crying. Her father would come in the evening after work and I asked what he could do, and I had her take Anika to dinner while he saw me dealing with the baby. Well, I did this for 2 days. Then the third day, I told Anika that night, I said, we're going to have to take her to the hospital. That third day, we went into the room. It was quiet. Her eyes were open. I touched her, and she had passed during the night. And it's really a bad part right here. When I was at the hospital for the first time, the medicine they were giving me made me have convulsions when I was in the bed. So I said, I can't keep taking this. They never said anything else about any other medicine. So I started spitting it out. Well, the time to come home, 5 minutes before I was going to leave, they come in there and give me a shot that's supposed to last for 3 weeks. And nobody, looked after me. They just said, you go to a center and you get another one. Well, when I went home, I was like a zombie from that shot. So that made it even worse. Well, I took quite a bit of medicines, different ones, and then they had me on a old medicine, and the name of it is Haldol. I started taking that 25 years ago. The voices were gone. I don't have excessive weight gain. I'm not real sleepy. It works for me. And at one point, one psychiatrist said, oh, they got this new medicine coming out, no side effects. I told him, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And stay with it, and I'm still with it.
I had a question. Do you have an idea of why this happened? This being your own personal condition? Yes.
I believe it's a brain disorder that I have. And the medicine keeps everything flowing right. And like I said, there's no prejudice. Anybody can get a mental illness. Be from here, you could be from Russia, you could be from outer space.
Yes. Do you know whether it's in the Cleveland area or anywhere where communities are beginning to do more for children whose parents are dealing with mental illness?
I've heard of, because we've been doing different talks, I've heard of, I think was it at Duke? There's like a few places that we've heard of them doing a lot more kind of family wraparound programs. We actually just gave a talk yesterday for an organization called Recovery Resources, and they have, and that's in the Cleveland area, and they have programs where they educate the parents, and they also have different things for both the parents, like mothers and their children as well. So there are a few, which is great, because a lot of those are new, and they just don't have a lot. Just don't have a lot of them.
It's like it's something that's just maybe...
Yeah. I think one of the big things that comes up with it is that so often our approach to healthcare has been just to focus on the person with the illness. A lot of times we don't always have a very holistic view, and so aren't always looking at the impact to the entire family. And so a lot of times, mental health providers don't even ask if there's children even in the equation, or what's always happening to the kids, and maybe looking at, you know, even if the parents might not healthy in the house, are there some ways that we can still give them some skills so they can still have a healthy rapport with their child? You know, there are not a lot of programs for children, but as my mom mentioned, there's not a lot of things that also teach parents with a serious mental illness how to even be a parent. You know, there are not a lot of those programs either, so they can have some healthy impacts in their child's life also. So I think there's a lot of need, and I think some of it's just about the way that we often approach healthcare, which doesn't always look at the whole family structure. I think we're starting to see some change around that, but I think there's a long way to go. Recovery, like as you kind of heard, my family always had me involved in like a million things. They wanted me to be a real culture little girl. So like even when I was doing like campfire girls, my mom she would volunteer with the other parents. So she was really very involved. I think when she was stable, she would have been probably more open to it. The problem is just that because especially during those early years, which was also when I was growing up, was the times when she was least stable. The thing about schizophrenia, it tends to strike a lot of times in the early 20s. Sometimes that can be some of those prime parenting times. And oftentimes recovery can be such a long road, you know, and it doesn't often happen overnight. So depending on when someone may have a child, they may be really struggling with the illness during those really key development times for a child. And while in stability you can have one thought, and sometimes when in crisis, you know, it's a whole different ballgame.